Hello, good evening, and a very warm welcome to this lecture by Kevin B. Lee. Its title is Double Agency, Fraught Positions in Postcolonial Film Analysis. It's the third event in our series of debates and talks in the framework of Fiktionsbescheinigung, 16 cinematic perspectives on Germany, an additional program of the Berlinale Forum. My name is Christina Nord. I'm the head of the Berlinale Forum, which is an independent section of the Berlinale, and the Arsenal Institute for Film and Video Art is in charge of it. I'm very happy that we can offer the film series and the digital debates, and I would like to express my deepest gratitude to the 5 curators who are in charge of the film series: Enoka Yemba, Karina Griffith, Jacqueline Zia, Bine Pilavci, and Can Zungo. I'd also like to thank the Forum's team, whose dedication, enthusiasm, and stamina fill my days with joy, and I mean every word of it. And of course, I'm deeply honored to welcome Kevin B. Lee. Kevin is a filmmaker, a media artist, and a critic. Through Bottled Songs, his collaborative project with Chloé Galibert-Lenné, he was awarded the 2018 Sundance Institute Art of Nonfiction grant, and that was by far not the only award or prize or grant he received. In 2020, he co-curated the Black Lives Matter video essay playlist together with Will DeGravio and Sidney Wild-Harris. He is professor of cross-media publishing at Merz Akademie Stuttgart, where he's also the co-director of the master program in artistic research. I'm very much looking forward to his lecture tonight, which will tackle crucial questions about the problematic legacy of Western images and the colonialist gaze inherent to them. But he won't stop there, but he will also tackle the analytical practices we use to dismantle these images. To what extent are these practices themselves inscribed in a colonialist logic? And if they were, how would we be able to deal with this? As I said, I'm very much looking forward to Kevin's thoughts and ideas, and I would like to pass the screen or the floor or the mic or however you want to call it these days to him.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Christina, for that very warm welcome, because I think I'm experiencing enough warmth as it is in being in Europe these days. I'm currently in Basel, where it's about 35 degrees Celsius. So I apologize for the rather luminous appearance of my face, and I hope that well, I'll be sharing my screen soon enough, so you won't have to look at this much longer. Yeah, I am very happy to have the honor of presenting about a rather tricky topic, about kind of how we deal with certain legacies and practices of post-colonialism, especially with regards to film studies, film criticism, and my own work with video essays. And if I can just get my presentation software to work, we'll have one less problematic element of this event to contend with. Okay, thank you, everyone. I hope you're still around. Sorry for that unfortunate technical problem, but now we can proceed with the presentation, which is relating to the screening series Fiktionsbescheinigung, 15 Perspectives of Germany, and thinking about the title of the topic and the theme of Fiktionsbescheinigung, it actually inspired me to share my own Fiktionsbescheinigung, which I will do right now. So I hope you can see it. There's a little bit of a view of it. So I received my Fiktionsbescheinigung on January 17th, 2020, as part of my process of acquiring permanent residency status in Germany and the European Union. When I got my residency card 5 months later, I had to turn in the Fiktionsbescheinigung. So all I have is this scanned copy, which doesn't do justice to the design qualities of the document because it had quite a luminous texture with this sort of pink and green color scheme and a design that somehow combined the rays of the sun with the scales of a dragon, as I kind of as I found it. So for a wallet-sized piece of paper, it possessed a remarkable degree of cult value, and I wish I could have held on to it. I received it here in the Landhauptstadt. Let me just put that link in the chat or in the Google. I received it here in the Office of Foreign Relations in Stuttgart, the Ausländerbehörde Landhauptstadt Stuttgart. As a professor at a German art academy, I had the benefit of being accompanied by my school's international affairs officer so that I could avoid the line like this. My colleague booked my appointments and translated my documents so that all I had to do was sign whatever parts of the documents she pointed to. Only occasionally would we have to sit in the waiting room, and it was there that I spent time in the presence of other foreign applicants, those who did not have the benefit of special assistance. Were they students, workers, refugees? I was uncertain as to their social positions and uncertain of what languages I heard them speaking. Was that Arabic, Russian, Hindi, Urdu? What I could discern was the anxious uncertainty on their faces and in their voices, such that I could perceive in their presence my own position of comfort, having the support of an institution who could designate me as an intellectual worker with skills deemed desirable for a permanent place in German society. Speaking about waiting, as I'm giving this presentation, I am aware that those of you who are still with us had to wait a while to have the presentation start. And I want to acknowledge your presence, and that at any time in this presentation, please feel motivated, please feel allowed to offer comments, feedback, questions as you like. I know how both not just technically demanding, but also cognitively challenging these online events are. So I really welcome the chance to have it more of a conversation rather than a monologue. That's actually one of the themes of this presentation, as you'll see. So I look forward to reading your commentary. So I had skills considered desirable for German society. What are those skills? Skills of film and media analysis and education, skills that I have practiced over the last 20 years, mostly in the form of video essays or videographic criticism, as it is called in academic circles. Videographic criticism is defined as the use of audiovisual materials to reflect critically upon themselves so that we may see them more deeply. I've pursued this practice well enough over the last 15 years to secure a teaching job in Germany and to be given the opportunity to discuss it among you at this moment. But in the last few years, I've become increasingly sensitive to the ways in which this work enables not only states of critical seeing, but states of critical blindness. Blindness to the underlying context these tools of videographic analysis are applied, and in service to what and to whom. For the longest time, I thought that my designation as a media expert could stand above any other designation that has been applied to me. As an American, as someone of Asian or Chinese descent, this profession-based way of identifying oneself and thinking about oneself has been supported during my 4 years living in Germany, where my racial background has never been commented upon, not nearly as much as my national background as an American, and neither of them so much as my profession as a filmmaker, an academic, a media expert. But now I have to ask myself, what are the underlying conflicts and anxieties that govern this hierarchy of designations? Earlier this year, I read a book that gave me some insight into my own history with visibility with regard to dominant white cultures in both the United States and Europe. The name of this book is Minor Feelings. The author is Kathy Park Hong. And I would like to share a relevant passage from the book. Perhaps it would help if I actually shared it as text. So if you just give me a moment, I will see if I can create a little text document. Unshare that and share this. Maybe make this a bit more legible for us. When I hear the phrase, Asians are next in line to be white, I replace the word white with disappear. Asians are next in line to disappear. We are reputed to be so accomplished and so law-abiding, we will disappear into this country's amnesiac fog. We will not be the power, but become absorbed by the power, not share the power of whites, but be stooges to a white ideology that exploited our ancestors. Here I would like to bring attention to the title of this talk, Double Agency. You may already know that in military language, as well as in the spy movies, the double agent is a spy who actually works against the side they are supposed to be working for. I guess I felt moved to adopt this term partly because of the condition of ambiguous identification and allegiance that it describes, but also because of the word agency as it relates to a subject's power. What does it mean to have more than one sense of agency? What role does one's awareness play in one's agency? In the movies, the double agent's true agenda is unknown to most others, but how much in control is the agent over their own agency? Can one operate as a double agent without even knowing it? And so in order to regard my own agency with greater clarity, I felt the need to produce a new kind of critical distance, not from the cinema that I have studied for years, but from the underlying conditions that inform my relationship to cinema. In the spring of 2020, I was spending the break from school, the semester break, in my hometown of San Francisco when the first wave of COVID shut everything down. And it would be 3 months before I would be able to return to my life in Germany. In that period, I had a lot of time to reflect on my childhood experiences and how they initiated my process of developing my identity as a media expert. And so now I would like to show you the outcome from that period, a short film titled Once Upon a Screen, Explosive Paradox, in which I revisit a formative experience involving a family excursion to the cinema. I believe if you're watching this on YouTube, the link will be shared now in the chat. And so now we will take 10 minutes for you to watch this video, and then I'll continue my presentation in 10 minutes. All right, well, thank you for watching the video, everyone. And again, if you have any comments or feedback that you would like to share at any time, please feel welcome to type it in the chat, and I would be happy to address it. So there is a lot I could say about this video, Once Upon a Screen, Explosive Paradox, but I will just make two basic remarks. First, I feel that this film resonates with the term minor feelings, the book by Kathy Park Hong, which she defines as follows. Minor feelings are the racialized range of emotions that are negative, dysphoric, and therefore untelegenic, built from the sediments of everyday racial experience and the irritant of having one's perception of reality constantly questioned or dismissed. Minor feelings arise, for instance, upon hearing a slight, knowing it's racial, and being told, oh, that's all in your head. So was this explosive paradox of watching Platoon all in my head? Apparently so, as this video was produced from memories that had halfway disappeared from my experience until COVID brought them out of deep storage and dredged them to the surface. Memories that, in some context, don't seem that remarkable. After all, who hasn't been bullied or called names as a child? Who hasn't experienced a painful disciplinary moment from their parents? Who hasn't seen a movie that was universally praised and then exited the theater feeling completely out of step with what the world thinks? In fact, these are all minor feelings, but they accumulate and they coalesce into something more than the sum of their parts. I also want to relate this short film to the subtitle of my talk, Fraught Positions in Postcolonial Film Analysis, because I would describe this video as a post-colonial video essay, which is different from other terms such as decolonial or anti-colonial, even though they are at times used interchangeably. I would not claim that this video that you just watched is decolonial or anti-colonial. To my mind, it's a post-colonial work because it offers a critical awareness of colonialism by way of describing its operations and its effects, but it does not quite do enough to overcome them or dismantle them. If you want to think it in rather like a crude metaphor, if you think of colonialism as a house with many, many flaws and many problems, post-colonialism would probably be to describe all of those flaws, all of those problems of this house, but still live inside the house, because in doing the calculations in one's mind, it still is somehow more beneficial to live inside the house and tolerate it than to leave the house. Whereas decolonialism would make strong efforts to fix all of the problems in the house, and anti-colonialism would be to either leave the house or just burn the house down. So, yeah, so one could say that this video expresses my own experience of colonial trauma, but diverts or sublimates it into expressions that are, let's call them socially or culturally acceptable expressions, a critical insight or an artistic work. This tendency towards sublimation was described quite forcefully and critically by the filmmakers Octavio Gattino and Fernando Solanas in their landmark 1970 manifesto, toward a third cinema. So let me see. I guess I have to. So just to kind of give a thumbnail sketch of what third cinema is and what the other two cinemas are. First cinema basically consists of regressive mainstream popular entertainment meant to function optimally within a capitalist system. Then there's second cinema, which encompasses art cinema, the cinema that is most preoccupied with social critique and artistic sublimation, endeavors that Gattino and Solanas decry as reactionary and consolatory gestures that prevent the possibility for true revolution and necessary change. The second cinema is a release valve cinema that releases the pressure of social dysfunction without using that pressure to build up and cause an explosive reaction and transformation of those conditions. In contrast, it is the third cinema, which is actually the cinema of the dispossessed, the cinema of those disenfranchised and have no stake in the system, that is truly radical because it does not content itself with formulating these tragic poetic negotiations to the conditions of oppression, but to instead imagine radical alternatives to them. This line between the second cinema and the third cinema is one that I would like to explore further, especially as it informs the work of filmmakers that I have long admired and even modeled myself after. The reason I moved to Germany was to be the resident of the Harun Farocki Institute in 2017. And following the residency, I was commissioned by the Goethe Institute to make a series of video essays about Harun Farocki, a task I took with due reverence to the subject. Farocki is one of my favorite and most influential filmmakers in my own practice and my own thinking. But it was only until years later that certain images and scenes from my deep engagement with Farocki have come back to my mind in more problematic ways. Specifically, I would like to talk about an image in the film Images of the World and the Inscription of War. In German, it's Bilder der Welt und den Inschrift des Krieges. You could actually see the image that I'm about to describe if you just Google the name of the film, Images of the World and the Inscription of War. It shows up quite readily if you search and is in many ways kind of an iconic representation of this film. But at this moment, I am uncomfortable showing this image to you for reasons I will explain. So what I would like to do now is to somehow enact this scene with the image with my own presence here on Zoom. There is a scene where Harun Farocki sits at a desk. We see him leafing through a book called Les Femmes d'Algérienne, the Women of Algeria, by Marc Garanger. Garanger was a photographer and a French soldier during the occupation of Algeria, and he was ordered to take photos of Algerian women for identification purposes, women whose faces normally were concealed, photographed against their will. Their faces were exposed in a mode of violence performed by colonialist image taking. In the film, Farocki turns the pages of Garanger's book, and with each turn, a different woman's face is exposed. And then at one moment, Farocki places his hand over the lower half of a woman's face, as if to recover the woman. Recover in multiple senses of the word. Recover her face in order to recover her right to her own image. When I saw this image, I was struck by the brilliance of this gesture as a mode of radical film studies performed by the body. It was the simple move of one's hand that one can not only study an image, but transform its meaning. It is a perfect example of the Farockian concept of the counterimage, das Gegenbild, an image that opposes another image in order to create a state of critical awareness and awakening. And in this case, one could also attribute this gesture with qualities of empathy and solidarity with the condition of the women in these photos. But now when I consider this gesture, I see something else at work. The hand of a male functioning within the context and the role of a Western researcher, performing a gesture of privilege and power over an image and the human being represented within it. In this respect, the gesture re-performs the violence over her who is captured by the image. So now when I see this image, I want to see it as a counter image, not only against the effects of the original photograph, but as a counter image against itself. How can that even be possible? Nothing in the image has changed. What has changed is my own way of looking at this image, that I now consider the woman in the image represented to be as much of a co-author and an agent of the image as Harun Farocki or Marc Garanger. Her image, her selfhood has become more legible to me, even if it remains woefully underarticulated. To do this, I have had to relinquish certain concepts of authorship and auteurship that have informed and dominated discourse of film and images for decades, if not centuries. But to speak of this woman, who can really speak on her behalf? I certainly won't claim to have the last word on this woman's image, or even on the significance of Farocki's attempt to comment on it. There are still more voices and perspectives in need of being heard. In this respect, I would like to share a different point of view on this image that has been communicated to me in an email exchange with Libertad Gilles, a filmmaker and researcher based in Ecuador. And these are her words, which I will now share with you. There's something playful in this gesture, don't you think? I am not sure if the hand is the counter image, but it certainly provides a feeling of the texture of skin that the face in the photograph, photographed again by Farocki, has lost. By placing his hand next to these women's faces, he seems to be proposing a human connection between himself and the women, more than simply a protective ethical gesture. In placing his hand there, he is also making himself vulnerable to the camera's eye, and therefore creating a possibility of empathy with the women in these photographs. Here, I find it noteworthy that what allows Libertad Gilles to redeem this gesture as one of solidarity is that she identifies what is missing in the original image that Farocki's hand brings back: the texture and dimension of a body, a human body, of human flesh. This observation is what allows me to feel comfortable enough to show you this image now, that somehow through the eyes of Libertad Gilles, it might be redeemed. Thinking further on the point that she makes, I think not only about the texture of Farocki's hand, but also its color, and by implication, Harun Farocki as a filmmaker of color. This aspect of Harun Farocki's life and career, as far as I know, has been grossly under-researched, partly because Farocki himself made little mention of it, as far as I can tell. And I won't speculate on reasons for this, but if I bring somehow my own hand into the picture, I can think of my own experience and the extent to which I have felt comfortable with not having to reflect on my social position and my identity in terms of the color of my skin, at least not until now. And now that I am able to see all of this more clearly, I can start to reflect on this decrepit movie palace of colonialist history and film. And I can start to look for the exit rows out of this movie palace. And I can search for an open airspace where people can engage with each other in new radical practices of cinematic agency, new forms of making, new forms of viewing, new forms of belonging. As someone still attached to the post-colonial legacies of cinema, I have to admit that I'm not quite there yet where I want to be. But in the meantime, I do have a Fiktionsbescheinigung.
Thank you very much, Kevin. That was super insightful. I'd like to encourage all of you who are watching to, if you have comments, questions, remarks, please write them down in the chat and I will pass them on to Kevin. However, this might take a minute, so I would like to come up with a question about the gesture of covering the mouth, which I found highly remarkable, that it's the mouth which is covered. Because that is also something of silencing, or could have something of silencing.
And I'm pretty sure it's not what Farocki intended at all. And one should attribute, how should we say, good faith. I think that is important to some extent, that, you know, I would interpret it generously that, you know, in Muslim cultures, it often is both the head and the mouth that are covered. And so one only sees the eyes. And so his attempt was to try to reenact that or recover that, that image, that appearance. But yeah, like you said, there's something about just the size of his hand as well. And as you said, it can be read as a hand literally over a mouth, and how one wants to interpret that. So this multiplicity of meaning and this, shall we say, and again, it gets back to the idea of the double agents, that one has a certain agency, but then given a larger set of social and cultural circumstances that maybe one has not fully seen or taken into account, that presents another type of agency that we then perceive. Sometimes it takes decades to see, or at least, or even if maybe it is seen at the moment, but then it takes decades to be fully acknowledged and to be dealt with, which I felt was necessary this evening. Oh, I think you're muted, Christina.
Yes, a rookie mistake. Sorry for that.
Well, I definitely had my share of challenges, shall we say.
I was about to say that we're improvising a little bit, I shouldn't be on screen in a certain way, but never mind. I'm going to go on asking questions unless I see something in the chat. So every time you see me watching my second screen, I'm sort of like looking for a question. There's none at the moment.
Okay.
What you said about the sort of like getting an idea and a consciousness about your own position and your own positionality is is something crucial, and sometimes it's more comfortable to pretend as if one had no specific position and no specific positionality. For me, I mean, for me, it's very different, but in a certain way, I can very much relate to it, because if I'm not bearing in mind that I'm female and cinema has a certain approach to female characters, to female filmmakers, to sort of like female talent, and it's not the nicest approach you can imagine. If I'm not taking that into account, I can enjoy cinema enormously. The very moment I start taking it into account, my position becomes delicate. And maybe you could sort of like elaborate a little bit more on this sort of like awareness of positionality.
Right. Well, given how you started this comment about this rather about objectivity, I guess, about this desire or myth of the objective view, or this even ascribe it to a kind of a scientific view, that in some ways it is a position of erasure, a position of invisibility, and a position of kind of some way like a great absolute power, that one doesn't have to account for oneself and can stand behind this pillar of objectivity to justify one's practices, one's way of seeing, and one's way of articulating. Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm the best person to really explain why that is problematic and how it got to be like this. But for myself, well, what I can do is talk about how this position has made itself known within the practice of video essays, at least video essays on the internet, which is the context from which I emerged, that for many years, from the mid-2000s, from the beginnings of YouTube, because that's where I started making video essays, up until only recently, most video essays were performed by young cis white males who use the video essay as an instrument of laying claim to the powers of objectivity and authority through video essay discourse. That one kind of had a certain mode of address, a certain rhetoric that they adopted that was meant to instruct others on like the correct way of understanding a film. And just to connect that to this sort of demographic phenomenon that it was really an overwhelming number of these types of young men that were practicing this, for me, made it very clear to what extent this matter of filmic education, discourse, and objectivity was tied to positionalities that wanted to, in some ways, not acknowledge themselves. And it's been amazing and wonderful that in the last few years, it's changed a lot, that many of the great and many popular video essayists on social media and YouTube are female, women of color, LGBTQ. It really has changed a lot, and I'm very grateful for this. And actually that this very theme of positionality does become a theme that is addressed directly in their video essays.
I think what you mentioned about sort of like the non-positionality of the so-called objective position, that is also something which I find highly interesting. And sometimes I think that it should be precisely that position that should start to reflect upon itself. So those who always think that their truth is sort of like a universal truth, that they're very close to objectivity, that they are not marked by any specific trait, whereas everybody else is. I think if the world was a better place, those positions would start to think about themselves.
Right, and I guess it leads to the question of what role do audiovisual practices that have a kind of pedagogical value like video essays, as well as institutions, universities and film festivals, what role do they have to play in facilitating this, shall we say, transition or transformation of discourse and a greater awareness of our positions? And I think a lot of it has to do with what does positionality mean for institutions themselves? You know, because I think institutions oftentimes will, they feel like they need to stake that kind of universal ground or lay claims to a certain authority through, I don't know, commonality. But then how is it that an institution can engage and negotiate with multiplicity and specificity of multiple positions? So, but I'm I guess that's that is the task that others deal with. I have my own.
Yeah, I think it is most certainly a very important task, and maybe at this point it's not easy to find something like an exit strategy out of the habits and the ways and the ways things are dealt with on a usual basis. We had in the past 2 days, this issue came up over and over again in the talks and discussions in the framework of this series of digital debates, how to get access, for instance, to institutions, and can you get access without violence? Can you get access without sort of like giving up what is specific about you? Or what's it like to gain access by patronage, which would also be problematic. So I think it is really, these questions are crucial, and the answer is far from being easy to find. I think it's very hard to come up with answers.
Yeah, there's also this matter of, how should we say, predictive or speculative positions, like how can one, given, you know, one thing I've learned from studying figures like Farocki and many other filmmakers who I have long admired is that one can make their best efforts, again, in good faith, to establish critical positions with integrity, making us more aware and more sensitive to the underlying politics of image practices, and yet in future contexts become susceptible and vulnerable to such criticisms. And so, you know, I can almost anticipate that things that I do now in good faith in a generation or even less than a generation will look much less flattering or positive. You know, I think, to be honest, one thing I'm already anticipating is just our widespread use of these like streaming technologies, which I have somewhat concern or awareness of just how much data and energy they're consuming. But, you know, we've all kind of collectively decided that this is how we get through Corona and COVID, and this is what must be done. But then we kind of get normalized and habituated to massive data consumption that relies tremendously on electricity and natural resources. And it may be in months or years to come that we start to perceive the full cost of this. Mm-hmm. And in half a generation or less or more, I will somehow be implicated in what might be considered like an environmental, you know, crime. But what, you know, what do we do? But you know, and is it enough just to even be aware of this? But to actually ask, okay, well, how do we organize ourselves socially and culturally in a way that can really address this problem. Maybe that's why I was, in the end of my talk, I was imagining an open air space that we could actually meet in person. But of course, I know, Christina, that, you know, given the circumstances, we had to do it like this. And you know, and I accept it. And I've done dozens of these events over the last 15 months, and it's actually really amusing that I really prided myself on being such an expert with Zoom events that I could just really, and then today it just blew up in my face, and I have to read, maybe I have to read some kind of underlying significance to this, that maybe I shouldn't get so comfortable and so proud of my facilities with virtual streaming technologies, and maybe we as a civilization shouldn't either.
Reminds me of the very beginning of the series, where my internet connection was unstable. The very moment I first appeared on screen, my internet connection basically was absent. Yeah, maybe something's sending us signs.
Sounds like the beginning of one of those Hollywood blockbusters where it's like, first you have the warning signs. Oh, people's internet is unstable. Oh, what could it mean?
And then Kevin B. Lee's computer.
Yeah, right.
And what happens?
Well, a minor tragedy.
Yeah. I was wondering, anybody having any questions, remarks, comments, please give me a sign via the chat, because if not, I think it might be a good moment to wrap up and come to an end. Thank you so much, Kevin, for sharing your thoughts. As always, super insightful, super interesting and intriguing. And for me, it felt a little bit like one of the conversations we have from time to time, when I'm really feeling intellectually refreshed afterwards, and even in spite of the heat. So thank you very much, Kevin. And I don't know, do you want to add anything at this point? Anything we haven't tackled?
I think there was a lot in here. If you know, if our audience wishes to respond to me, my website has my contact information, also likelife.com, and yeah, but of course, I just hope that there is something in the presentation that others find valuable in any way, however critical a response one might have, and I certainly wouldn't hold it against them. I think criticality is important.
Thank you very much. Before I say goodbye, I would like to point out the two events we have tomorrow, also digital events. So there will be a lecture by Bine Pilavci on her film Dancing Alone, and film as a means to self-empowerment. And then in the evening, we will have a big conversation, which is quite interactive and quite experimental. And I'd really like to encourage you to have a look at the forum's website, check it and register and take part. Thanks again, Kevin, and see you soon.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Christina. Thank you, everyone. Bye.